What if I told you the entire global chessboard could be flipped overnight? I mean, years of policy, sanctions, alliances, all of it, just tossed aside after one single meeting between two leaders. Well, that's the incredible and kind of wild scenario we're breaking down in this Explain.
So, it all boils down to this question, right? How does a guy who's seen as a global outcast, an international war criminal, suddenly get the red carpet treatment? And, maybe more importantly, what happens to a key ally who's now being pushed to just give up? The answers? Well, they could change everything we think we know about global power.
All right, so let's get into it. It all kicked off with one single event, a summit up in Alaska that pretty much sent shockwaves around the entire planet.
You know, what's really stunning here is just how fast this all happened. I mean, for 3 solid years, Vladimir Putin was basically a pariah on the world stage. Then, boom, seemingly overnight, he's not just on a call with the US president, he's getting a full-blown red carpet welcome. That handshake, that was it. That was his formal invitation back into the international community.
So, to really understand how we got to this point, you have to look at the timeline. It starts back in 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine. Right after that, the West just threw the kitchen sink at Russia, right? We're talking massive sanctions, asset freezes, embargoes, anything and everything to isolate Moscow and get them to back down. But according to the source material, it just didn't work. The main goal wasn't achieved. And that's what apparently led the Trump administration to say, okay, let's try something completely different.
Now, Putin didn't just show up for a photo op. He came to this summit with a very clear 3-point agenda. First, he needed a symbolic win to end his isolation. And that red carpet? Check. He got that right away. Second, he needed economic relief. Get those crippling sanctions lifted and get trade going again. And third, well, this is the big one. He wanted to control Ukraine's future security, basically to make sure it could never align with the West.
In this quote, wow, it just perfectly captures the immediate fallout. Right after that meeting, the entire message from Washington to Kyiv did a complete 180. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about defending Ukraine's sovereignty anymore. It was all about making concessions to Russia to end the war and to end it now.
So as you can probably imagine, this brand new US-Russia dynamic put Ukraine in, well, a totally impossible position. Okay, so picture this. Just 3 days after that summit, President Zelensky shows up in Washington. But this is a very different Zelensky. The defiant, confrontational leader we were all used to seeing, he's gone. In his place is a man who clearly has to play a different game now, taking a much softer, more diplomatic approach. You can tell he knows the ground is completely shifted under him.
And get this. Here's a small but really telling detail that shows you just how intense the pressure was. In the first 6 minutes of his speech, he says thank you 8 times. The source we're looking at flags this as a very deliberate tactic. It's a way to appease, to show deference to a president who, well, is known to respond to that kind of thing.
And this really lays out the grim new reality for Ukraine. I mean, for years, their whole strategy, backed by the US, was fight for every single inch of our land. But now, with that American support suddenly in question, they're being forced into this land swap peace deal.
So what exactly is this deal they're talking about? Well, the idea on the table is that Russia would get to keep the occupied regions of Donetsk and Luhansk forever. And in exchange, they might return control of Zaporizhia and Kherson. Now, it's being called a peace deal, but let's be real. For Ukraine, it means losing a huge chunk of their country. It's a massive concession.
And then came the final nail in the coffin, at least for Kyiv's long-term goals. The Trump administration made it crystal clear that long-held dream of Ukraine joining NATO, it's over, it's off the table. And of course, this was always one of Putin's biggest demands.
Of course, a massive shift like this doesn't just impact Ukraine. You better believe it's in a huge wave of anxiety rippling across all of Europe. And that's exactly why Zelensky didn't show up in Washington by himself. Look who he brought with him. The leaders of Germany, France, the UK, Italy, plus the head of NATO. They were there to show a united front, to basically tell the US president, hey, this new path you're on, it is seriously worrying to your oldest and closest allies.
But they ran into a brick wall almost immediately. See, the European position was really clear. Before any real talks can happen, Putin has to announce an immediate ceasefire. Stop the fighting first. The Trump administration's new goal, though, was to just leapfrog right over that and push for a big overall peace deal, even while the war was still raging.
So you gotta ask, right? Why the big rush for a deal instead of a ceasefire? Well, the source material speculates that the motivation here might be a little more personal. Think about it. Ceasefires don't usually win you a Nobel Peace Prize, but brokering a huge peace deal, even a controversial one, that just might. It's a shot at a legacy-defining moment.
Okay, so that brings us to the final and maybe the most complicated piece of this whole geopolitical puzzle. The super awkward spot this leaves a major player like India in.
I mean, think about the contradiction here. For months, the U.S. was hitting India with sanctions for buying Russian oil. But now, the U.S. president is literally rolling out the red carpet for the very same guy India was punished for doing business with. So where does that leave India? And this table from the source really drives the point home. It highlights what looks like a major hypocrisy. Look, China, the European Union, Turkey, they were all buying huge amounts of Russian oil, and yet no sanctions from the Trump administration? India was the only one that got singled out.
So what was the official justification for this? Well, according to a senior advisor, the thinking went something like this. If we go after Russia's customers, like India, it'll hurt Putin's bottom line and force him to come running to us to make a deal. The source we're analyzing calls this bizarre logic.
But the source material argues that the real reason was a lot more cynical. The thinking was India was an easy target. They probably wouldn't hit back too hard. So by sanctioning India, the administration could look tough on Russia for voters back home, all without picking a fight with bigger players like China or the EU. In other words, India was basically used as a bargaining chip.
And it wasn't just the one thing. According to the source, this was a deliberate two-pronged punishment. So India got slapped with sanctions for the Russian oil, and at the same time, they were getting hit with extra tariffs because of a totally separate trade issue.
So when you put it all together, what do you get? A brand new geopolitical reality. A new global chessboard where alliances can change in a heartbeat. Commitments don't mean what they used to, and the line between who's a friend and who's an adversary has gotten really, really blurry.
And all of this leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling question to think about. In a world where the rules can change this fast, where everything seems to be driven by personal relationships and domestic politics, who can any nation, big or small, really truly count on?